Okay, I think we are ready to start. I'm very pleased to have Dr. Elise Prebin as the actually a first speaker of this semester that CKS hosts this year, 2010. She received PhD in social anthropology at the University of Paris West Notre, and she was a lecturer at Harvard in Korean anthropology, and from this March, she'll be teaching at Hanyang University in Korea. So that will be another exciting journey for her. Her research includes Korean side of translational adoption. And recently, Elise has been working on a research project about funeral industries and practices in Korea, Japan, and China, which is a very fascinating topic. She'll be talking about that topic today. The title of her talk is Ashes Disposal in Contemporary South Korea, Continuities and Discontinuities. There's one statistic that I found very interesting in her abstract of her talk, which is that cremation rates in Korea increased from 7% to 60%, almost ninefold increase in South Korea in the last 20 years. So I found that statistic quite interesting. From my personal experiences, my family now thinking about having a family site, funeral site in Korea, and relocating my ancestors' site. So I have been involved in those discussions, and I realized there are many options available. And she'll talk about these and various changes happening in Korea and meanings of these phenomena in Korea as well. So please join me welcoming Dr. Prebin.
Well, thank you very much for having me and hosting this event and my talk, and thank you for coming to the talk. I'll move a little bit. At the end of the 14th century, Confucianists tried to impose burial as the proper disposal of the dead. They did so for political reasons, a way to oust Buddhism as the state religion that promoted cremation, but also in an attempt to rationalize so-called superstitious beliefs common in all strata of society. To emphasize also filial piety as the basis for morality, and to homogenize practices. Government officials encountered resistance for 2 centuries, but by the 17th century, burial, according to the principles of geomancy, had become the only proper funerary practice in the Korean peninsula. Practices, however, changed only with the acceptance of new values surrounding death and familial relations, that is, with the emergence of a new culture. In the 90s, when the cremation rate was only 7%, the South Korean government encouraged the nation to switch back from burial to cremation, but failed to do so as it merely evoked economic incentives. Only after the Non-Governmental Council for the Promotion of Cremation was established in 1998 and promoted a new funerary culture did the trend change. Today, more than 60% of South Koreans choose cremation. So does it mean that funerary culture has deeply changed? If so, what are the main aspects of that new culture? And from which kind of values and sociocultural context have these new practices developed and spread? First, I think it's good to go back to the past to better evaluate how much change occurred. I will talk about the Confucianist promotion of burial against cremation during the Joseon period. Second, I will talk about the failed attempts to reinstitute cremation in the 20th century. By analyzing the organization and discourse of the Council for the Promotion of Cremation, I will show that the return to cremation, although often promoted as an ancient tradition from the pre-Confucian past, or a better way to express filial piety, is also bringing to the fore a mix of secular and global views of nature and technology, while exacerbating social distinction. Third, I will turn toward people's responses to this campaign and show how they adjust their practices to the new circumstances. To do so, I will use pictures that reflect both continuities and discontinuities in today's South Korean funerary culture. So I will keep the pictures mostly for the third part of my talk. So what are the pre-Confucian ways of disposing of the dead? As Martina Döschler's research has evidence, funerary practices in pre-Confucian Korea differed widely from one region to the other and from one class to the other. The dead were sometimes buried, sometimes exposed outside, in the fields or in the streets, sometimes cremated within Buddhist temples. Buddhist temples in general had an important role in the handling of death, especially amongst the upper class. Cremating the dead was a way to purify the pollution caused by death. It was thought of accelerating the process of transmigration of the soul toward reincarnation and enlightenment. Who promoted the standardized Confucian funerary culture? Well, Confucianism slowly spread from the top to the bottom of the social pyramid between the 14th and the 18th century, changing the face of kinship, of familial relations, and everyday life. Neo-Confucianists aimed at simplifying and standardizing rituals surrounding death. So Buddhist-type cremations on a pyre were forbidden in 1395. A special burial office was established in 1410 in Seoul to punish people who abandoned corpses in the streets. The Confucian government finally banned cremation in 1470. Neo-Confucianists also promoted a new representation of one's parents. Their souls could no longer be imagined as getting retributions for their misdeeds in the different realms of the afterworld or their different hells. Not only their souls, but also their bodies became sacred. Dead bodies had to be buried and protected against insects, bad weather, tree roots, etc. The conservation of the dead in the most auspicious locations was seen as a way to ensure the perpetuation of lineages and the prosperity of descendants. I should also mention that the bodies of the dead were protected by very thick coffin. And sometimes they would put cereal so that insects eat the cereals but not the body. That's what Martina Döschler has written. So choosing the location of tombs according to the principles of geomancy became crucial. Yet, the upper class still preferred cremation, or the burial. In general, Confucian principles regarding funerals and burial were more respected in the capital. According to Döschler, in Pyongyang, for example, coffins were unknown, even among the elite. Corpses were exposed to the elements in open fields and rocky cliffs, covered only lightly with a few stones. She also says that even the wives of officials who were enforcing Neo-Confucianism were reluctant to adopt the new funerary culture and instead view Buddhism as providing the most satisfactory meaning and right services for the dead. Neo-Confucianists also wanted people to apply the 5 great mourning system, the Obokche, that was officially accepted since the Koryo period, but only loosely practiced. Later on, people who mourned their parents 3 years, who lived in a shed they built next to their tombs, who wore the mourning gown made of coarse fabric, and respected recommended restrictions on sex and foods, were reported to local governors, and later to the king. They were rewarded by special ceremonies and stels, reading their names and their deeds. So it's interesting to see that the new funerary culture generated, of course, new problems. For example, the Neo-Confucianists disagreed as to whether or not people from lower classes, slaves or farmers, for example, should respect the same etiquette and mourn their parents for 3 years, even if they had a lot of work to do. Also, the auspicious locations and mountains in Seoul were quickly covered by tombs, and the shortage of auspicious places provoked very vicious disputes between families that sued each other. I found in 2007 a master's thesis on that topic. What is the Confucian way of mourning and disposing of the dead? Here I should stress that we should talk about Confucian and funerals or way of mourning in the present tense, because in fact if you go to remote places, maybe not Seoul, but in the countryside, and until a very recent past, even in the capital, you could see these type of funerals and these ways of mourning. And this is evidenced by the production of 2 films in '96, so it's fairly recent, by Im Kwon-taek and Park Chul-soo. So Neo-Confucianism emphasizes the continuance of the patriline, strict hierarchy within family and society, the importance of rituals, the demonstration of filial piety, especially through funerals and the worship of ancestors. But the new funerary culture retained many pre-Confucian aspects. Buddhist monks are still today in charge of funerals in many instances. Even today, especially in the countryside, the ritualized sadness and the grieving preceding burial still give ways to boisterous festivities, as illustrated in somewhat recent films, as I said earlier. Moreover, Confucianism never erased the lasting belief in the malevolent dead. Hence the high number of shamans living and practicing that art in every neighborhood of today's Seoul. The belief in the inauspicious dead that come back to haunt, torment, and harm the living stresses the need to care for one's ancestors, and therefore, in a way, reinforces the importance of filial piety. The living make sure the dead are well to prevent them from returning with the resentment. The geomancer makes sure the tomb is well located, and the shaman transmits the bitter messages from the dead to the living to help the latter satisfy the former by offerings and consolatory words. Funerals are the public affair. There is the announcement that the person is dead, the cleaning of the body, then the wake. Here I should add also that it used to happen at home, but as you can imagine, now most people die in hospitals and are taken care of by companies. Mourners address the dead in litanies and weep violently, especially when the coffin is closed or the coffin goes down in the earth. There is a procession to the burial ground, and the ranking of the mourners is respected. The whole village or all acquaintances, including co-workers, friends, neighbors, attend. The rank of the guests is expressed by the size of the flower arrangements offered and the amount of money given to the family. So again, the location of tomb mounds is chosen according to the principle of geomancy, usually at the boundary between the human world and nature, the world of spirits. A good location for the dead is a promise of prosperity for the descendants. So now I will move on to the second part of this talk. I will talk about the proponents of cremation in modern South Korea. Who has promoted cremation in modern Korea? Well, Korean history shows several failures to switch back from burial to cremation. First, the Japanese, who viewed the Korean colony as backward and dirty and non-hygienic, constructed the first crematorium in 1914 and the first public cemeteries that still exist today. Historians presume that these measures remained unsuccessful as they were viewed as yet another means of coercion from the colonizers. They concern only 1% of the population, probably the poorest or the dead without families, or maybe also the malevolent dead. Public cemeteries and cremation were very unpopular until the 80s. I heard from one of my informants that the plots of many horror movies that were produced in that period took place in the public cemeteries, meaning that the dead were not happy in these places. So it was very unpopular, and mostly the poor would resign to choose them. Even during the Korean War, the dead were seldom cremated. Park Chung-hee tried also to reform ritual life in general, like wedding ceremonies or rituals in the 60s and 70s. But he was also unsuccessful. The National Assembly rejected proposals for a new funeral policy in 93 and in 97. In 93, the law solely limited the size of individual, familial, and clan tombs. Only after the emergence of a democratic government, the emergence of a large educated middle class, and the constitution of the citizens' movements, influenced by international new social movements in the early 90s, such as the gay rights movements or any environmental groups, did the attitude towards cremation really began to change. In a joint effort, South Korean NGOs, university professors, and the media were successful in promoting cremation to protect the environment, but also for other reasons I will mention later. Recently, the revised legislation on funeral policy officially restricted the size of graveyards and the period of holding graves to a maximum of 60 years in 2001. In 2008, the government issued the main definitions of legal ash disposals and licenses for companies who want to open private cemeteries. Here, I will give 3 examples of institutions who contributed to the success of cremation at the turn of the 21st century. So in the summer of 2007, when I started researching this topic, I went to South Korea, I went to Seoul, and I was looking for one specific person, somebody I have been told about, who had written French, dissertation in French in geography, and who had compared the cemeteries one finds in the Gyeonggi region, where Seoul is, with the cemeteries found in the Parisian region. So I found him, and he was at the head of one of the branches of the Seoul Development Institute as an urban planner. He was very pleased I was interested in his old dissertation. He gave it to me, and he also, of course, helped me find the network of people who are looking at the issue in South Korea. So he recommended that I go quickly to the Korean National Council for the Promotion of Cremation that was created by university professors and is a non-governmental organization, although its members are granted funding from the government depending on their research project. So I think it's very interesting to see that the proponents of burial in the past were already the educated elite, the government officials, and how today, I guess the educated elite, the university professors, are also in charge of, main cultural changes in South Korea. So the headquarters of the council are located in the Daehangno neighborhood, consists in one big room and a few desks for its 4 members, permanent members. So the president I have never met, the secretary general, Professor Pak from LG University, a historian from Sungyeongwon, Professor Pak as well, and at the time a master's student from LG University that served as a secretary. So the permanent members of the council gather with other members of the board that are all professors, academics from different universities. They gather in groups of, let's say, 15 to 20 people, and with the money from the government, they go on long trips around the world to study cemeteries, take pictures, make comparisons, publish, and teach their findings. They also own the most extensive collection of books on death, cremation, symmetries, among which many theses and dissertations that were never published. The council is currently the biggest producer of publications on cremation. It publishes a journal once or twice a year, books, articles, and brochures. It organizes also many events in the whole country, like university seminars, street demonstrations, exhibits, in subway stations, for example, meetings with big corporations and sponsors. Only LG University has a department of funerary science. It is the University of Medicine and Welfare that is located in Seongnam and Daejeon. LG Hospital was created in 81, became a college in 97, and a university in 99, and was renamed in 2003. Other universities offer courses on funerary culture within pre-existing departments, like the Anthropology department, or Sociology, or History departments. So it's very different from the Japanese situation, where in many, I mean, most of universities, you see these centers for life and death centers, or because aging and death have been important topics of research in Japan now for several decades. In the next section, I will stress the main arguments used by the agents of social change to persuade the population to change their practices. What are the main arguments to cremate the dead in the late 90s? I will say there are 5 main arguments. The first one is economic. If you choose cremation, that will help the development of a country, whereas if you choose burial, you will prevent it. Right now, burial grounds in South Korea represent 1% of the national territory. So there's a serious lack of space and profitable space. Plus, abandoned cemeteries represent 40% of all cemeteries. The second argument is scientific. If you choose cremation, you will protect the environment. I think it's good to remember that in the 90s, South Korea saw the rise of large NGOs composed of middle-class, highly educated citizens. Most of the NGOs are very large, all-encompassing organizations. They deal with anti-corruption campaigns, consumption, education, as well as environmental issues. So the proponents of cremation say if you choose cremation, you will protect forests. If you build mounds in the mountain, you will cut trees around it, and that will provoke some mudslides. So I think the best example of this is found in the shape of a monument in a public cemetery. So the government decided to erect this monument for the corpses that were victims of mudslides. So basically some traditional tombs were disappeared because the mudslides were so important that the bodies were not recovered. And I think the government, as a warning, decided to build this showy monument. It is also, of course, a question of hygiene. And here it's very interesting to see that the academics' definition of pollution is still weaker than the common definition of pollution that is not based on scientific facts. So the academics will say if you choose cremation, it will be much more hygienic because it's only ashes and they can disappear, but in fact, the population is still very reluctant and sees the ashes as pollution. The third argument is historical. As I said earlier, a lot of these academics are historians. So of course, they look at the past and they go very far. They skip the Confucian past and they go to the pre-Confucian past when the elite was cremated. Cremation was a good thing, they say, and there's no reason to reject it today. It happened in the past. The fourth argument is pragmatic. It just makes life easier for the family of the dead. So they bring up this argument that it's much cheaper than burial. So they say it's something like 15% cheaper than burial. But in fact, if you conduct research, you will interview people, and first of all, you will realize they are very reluctant to say, yeah, I picked it because it's cheaper. They don't want to say that. Usually they will over-evaluate the price they paid for the whole funeral. And in many instances, they actually spend as much money, if not more, than if they had chosen burial. Because even if cremation itself is cheap, they will compensate that cheapness by buying the most expensive material or the most expensive coffin, urn, or the most expensive shrine or niche in a Columbarium. And they will also buy a lot of artifacts. One thing that is not under discussion is that it's less maintenance. And the proponents of cremation also argue that the new disposal of ashes allows for a closer relationship to the dead. So I'll get back to this aspect at the end of this talk. The last argument is religious. cremation, all of a sudden, makes the dead happier than burial. So using scientific arguments, the proponents of cremation will say that burial, contrary to the common belief, does not preserve the body at all from corruption. And they mention, some evidence of people digging for the remains of their dead and being so horrified by the sight of the corpse, And they say if you pick cremation, all this will be purified in 2 hours, and it's much easier. They will also revisit the notion of second death. So until very recently, second death was cremation itself. People said the person dies first, but if you cremate the body, then the dead body suffers in the furnace, and it's the second death you inflict on your ancestors or your dead. So now the proponents of cremation will change that definition and say the government at some point will force you, no matter what, to cremate your dead. So you will bury the dead first, and then you will cremate them second, and why not cremate them right away? So now let's turn towards people's choices and motivations to choose cremation and the different ash disposals. So there are 4 general categories of South Korean symmetries. The first one, of course, is the familial symmetry located in mountains, usually that belong to families or clans. So here you have a traditional mound of a commoner, I would say, because there's no sign, there's no stele, you don't know who is there, only the family knows, and sometimes they don't even find it. And it's surrounded by forests, and you can imagine that many of them are lost or abandoned, and you will see it because of their shape. It will have no grass on top, or it will be cracked, etc. Second, you have the monumental symmetries, so reserved to the national heroes, the military, but also the kings in the past. So here's an example of the king's tomb. Then you have the public symmetries I mentioned earlier that were created by the Japanese colonial government in the 1920s. So here's, I guess, renovated and cleaned up public cemetery, and you see twin tombs, usually a husband and a wife. In another public cemetery, similar tombs. And then you have the private cemeteries that belong to companies and churches. The most numerous group of cemeteries that are very difficult to manage because they popped up and they multiplied with the urbanization of the 80s and 90s. Oh, I forgot to mention, this is also a public cemetery, and you see that there's a minimal display of religious affiliation. You just see the crosses that indicates if the tomb is Catholic or Protestant or Buddhist. So here's a private cemetery that is Buddhist. Nothing, tells you it's Buddhist, but if you go inside, you will see that in the very new building, people have in fact created a brand new Buddhist temple. So this is the same institution. This is another private cemetery that is not restricted to Buddhists only, but open to anyone. So why do people choose cremation? In South Korea, Christianity represents around, let's say, 40% of the population. Up to 30% are Protestant, and less than 10% are Catholic. The attitudes of Protestantism and Catholicism towards Korean culture seem to play a crucial role in the contemporary funerary practices of the population. Catholic influences in Korea are tracked back to the end of the 18th century. Catholicism was favorable from the beginning to ancestor worship and against cremation until 1963. The Council of Vatican II put an end to this interdiction as sanitary issues in the Western cemeteries grew. The South Korean Catholic Church allowed cremation in 1991. introduced by different oh no, sorry, I forgot something. The South Korean Catholic Church allowed cremation in 1991. Introduced by different Anglo-Saxon missions after liberation, and more so after the Korean War, Protestantism always disapproved the worship of ancestors, which induces a lesser importance of burial in auspicious places, of course, and other rituals around the traditional tombs. All my Protestant informants told me that their family opted for cremation naturally because they did not perform the rituals for the ancestors on the Day of the Dead, Chuseok, or the New Year's Day, Solal. They viewed cremation as more economical and more pragmatic. And in fact, within one family, if you have some members who are Protestant or others who are Catholic or Buddhist, it happens, the Protestant members of the family bow very lightly. They just bow with their head, but they don't bow on the ground. So they differ in their practices. In public cemeteries, I saw signs forbidding the display of religious affiliation in crematoria and observed very little space reserved for the rituals for ancestors, either in outdoor or indoor columbarium. There were only a few altars outside in a few cases that had to be shared by many families, and one room on each floor of another columbarium for maybe hundreds of altars, hundreds of shrines, just one altar in one room. This scarcity indicates as much the will to discourage any kind of fanciful ritual demonstration as the fact that a majority of Protestants choose cremation, put ashes in urns they place in columbarium niche, and do not perform confession rituals. Here I would like to add that hospitals and crematoria alike are our spaces for the scientific handling and the disembodiment of the dead. So just to show you the atmosphere in a crematorium, I'll show you a few pictures. So here you see the bereaved family in black looking at an employee pushing the coffin within the furnace, and they are behind a wall and behind a window. So they are very remote from the dead body. They probably didn't take care of it or wash it because the company in the hospital did it for them. And they also saw the washing of the body behind glass. Here you see the employee. I'm sorry, the picture is not great, but the employee, in fact, is wearing white gloves because there's this emphasis on cleanliness because, you know, public crematoria and cemeteries were had a very bad reputation. So now they overdo it and they really show that they clean everything and is impeccable. So the employee just has to push the red button and that will close, you know, the door of the furnace, and everything will happen behind doors. The bereaved family can wait around 2 hours in the waiting room and see the progress of cremation on the screen. And you see that this crematorium can handle 15 cremation at the same time. Here you see a common room with only one table. The objects that many families will have to use. So this kind of room is at each floor of the columbarium, and you can imagine that on certain days there will be lines of families waiting to use the room. And just as a reminder, until a recent past, the physical contact with the dead body was prevalent. People express their emotions very dramatically, and things happen at home. So you see the contrast. So what are the options after cremation? As Professor Kwak has said, there are many. You can put the ashes in urns and place them in a familial tomb that look traditional, but in fact encloses ashes only. So you see this tomb has the black compartments. That's where you put the urn. So obviously it's a familial tomb in a public cemetery. You can also spread by hand a part of the ashes of the dead. You mix with earth and spread them in these little enclosures called the memorial park. And the geographer I mentioned earlier is very proud to say that he's the one who introduced that new concept because he saw it in France. So around these memorial parks, because there are many in that area of the public cemetery, you have this altar that can serve any kind of ceremonies. You see the fence encloses one of them, one of the memorial parks. You can also bury the ashes mixed with earth underneath a tree. So it's very interesting. A professor from, I think a philosophy professor from Sogang University, one day decided that he would bury the ashes of the dead, of like somebody from his family, underneath a tree. And for some reasons, his action was covered by the media and became a big fad. So from 2004 to 2008, everybody wanted to do that. But I will tell you later why, but this practice is decreasing in popularity today. So here you see trees of private cemetery, and that private cemetery was built right then when the memorial forests were very popular. So the section devoted to memorial forests was filled up the first year, whereas the rest, the Columbarium, has still like empty niches. The same company advertise this practice on their website. So they show you how you do it. You put a portion of the ashes mixed with earth on the traditional Korean paper, hanji. You dig a hole, you put the package in there, you close the hole, and you can conduct the ritual, put the flowers, etc. But there are many different ways to do it. And this is the Japanese style. Here in another private memorial forest, you see funerals going on. Buddhist monks are reading sutras or conducting the ritual. And I would like you to notice the many trees that were cut around the trees that were bought by the families. So that's why it's a problem. That practice became a problem because it's not eco-friendly. People cut trees and also destroy the forest and nature. And in some instances, people just went to any forest and any tree, decided it was a nice tree, and cut the other trees around it, and maybe they were smoking and they provoked fires, etc. Here is very interesting. You see the tree, you don't see it well, but you see the shadow of it, and next to it, some ashes have been buried, but people are still attached to the traditional mound. So they created a miniature tomb shape with some grass and a miniature wooden stele. Here you see it even better. This tree obviously has been bought by one family, and they probably transferred some remains, ashes from tombs, and they put all the members of the family around the tree. And they also try to reconstitute the mound. The other practice is to disperse ashes at sea or in mountains. So earlier I showed you the memorial parks where people can spread by hand ashes. These were created also to prevent people from spreading ashes anywhere. Because I said earlier, people still consider ashes as pollution. So they are not happy when they see the white powder like next to their garden or next to a river, because they think they will drink the pollution. It's the dispersal of ashes at sea has been regulated by the government, and now I think there's I know there's one spot in the Incheon Harbor with a boat that is that can be used for that purpose only. I don't have pictures for that. So the last kind of disposal is the Columbarium. So there are many kinds of columbaria. This one shows you the individual niches in or shrines in a public cemetery, and you see there's almost no space for personalized artifacts or pictures. You see very small pictures, only the names. You have the numbers, but it it's very sober, and it's cheap. You see on the right side some outdoor niches. They are more decorated, but still it's limited, you know. And you see these altars that can be used by, you know, everyone. Only two in that section of the, in that area of the public cemetery. Here you have underground niches in the public cemetery. And outside, from the same building, you see this woman conducting the rituals on the altar that everyone, again, can use. Some other new indoor niches in the public cemetery. And older, old filled up niches of the outdoor columbarium in the same public cemetery. Despite the seemingly scientific nature of cremation, I think that cremation hasn't yet erased the previous system of belief regarding death and the afterlife. Instead of simplifying and standardizing the disposals of the dead, cremation has actually brought an extreme stratification of the dead according to class or religion. It has also allowed for more personal expressions of the relationship with the dead. When you are a social anthropologist, you wonder what to make of all this diversity. You wonder what are the principles underlying, you know, practices or people's choices, because you cannot only look at the arguments given by people who know, or people who are educated, or people who are specialists of these questions, right? You have to know how, you have to look at how people adjust to these new constraints. So I think that at least as a first, at the first stage, we can look at them in terms of continuities and discontinuities. So what are the continuities with the pre-Confucian and the Confucian past? Well, I think a little bit everywhere you can recognize some forms and patterns from the past. Earlier I showed you the miniature mound, right? Here you have a giant mound. And if you don't see the entrance, that is of course not traditional looking, you could see the same shapes, for example, in Gyeongju, where you have these monuments from the Shilla period. So they did it on purpose, of course. They built this columbarium and gave it a traditional shape so that they could connect the present and the remote past. Yes. Inside one of them, you have these very new paintings that actually reproduce some well-known Koguryo patterns, a period when, again, the elite preferably cremated their dead. I said earlier that the traditional mound from the Confucian culture are located in sunny sides of mountains, so in nature, the limit between the human world and the spirit world. So here in that very high-end, you know, high-tech columbarium, this private cemetery, people who decorated the place tried to bring nature indoors by this, by hanging this painting of rice paddies. You see this urn has the shape of a lotus with a Buddha sitting on it. So something from, you know, Buddhist culture, of course. And also the second thing is people are using more and more artifacts like miniature furniture. Like here you see dining table, chairs, and tea set, sewing machine. Here they try probably to reproduce I called it a bourgeois interior because it kind of is reminiscent of the interiors you see in dramas, you know, rich characters in their Western-looking houses. So you see the mother knitting, and there's a tea set again, and children reading on the couch. The furniture looks Western, European, I would say. And then you have the cello in the background, etc. So of course, people surmise, I mean, specialists or anthropologists surmise that people may express also their desire of society in the afterworld. And this is something very common if you go to some regions of China. Anthropologists have shown, like James Watson has shown that people burn some paper cars, some paper TVs, some paper furniture, beds, chests. And when they disappear in ashes, they are said to have gone to the other world. Here, the difference is they remain, of course. But they change, people change the organization at their shrine. If you go back the year after, they are added some objects, etc. They also put food or alcohol. You see this bottle of, I think, pet seju. Yeah. I like it too. Very interestingly, some families, for some reasons, have sold the familial mountain, and they probably got a lot of money for it. But they, of course, cared for the remains of their ancestors. And here you have the remains of the most remote ancestors on top from the 19th century. You have the dates, and all the ashes of the ancestors were transferred the same day in that private cemetery, and the descendants have bought 4 double niches and placed all the remains by order of generation. So they basically reproduce the structure of the familial burial ground. And you have the patriline on the left. You have like all the males' names on the left and different names on the right, because women do not change their name when they marry. Here you have a slightly different example. Some people have bought niches in advance. So you see that the grandfather has passed away, so his ashes are in the urn on top on the left. And the other urns are empty. But again, it reproduces the patriline. I would suspect that the second niche in the middle is for the son and his wife, and then the third one will be for the grandson and his wife. So something that hasn't disappeared and has been exacerbated is the obsession with social distinction and stratification. You see that tombs, monumental tombs for important families have not totally disappeared with cremation. Here, this monument that is in a private cemetery has, features a Buddha or Bodhisattva image in front, meaning that the family is Buddhist. And on top, you have this huge marble orange crab that represents the source of wealth of that family. The head of the family was the founder of a chain restaurant, a crab restaurant. Yes. It's not random. Something that also that hasn't disappeared, as I said earlier, is the belief in the inauspicious dead. And of course I have anecdotes for that, but I don't have much time, so I'll just mention the fact that one employee of that very high-end public cemetery in Columbarium told me that she sees every now and then during funerals geomancers going with the buried family, choosing to choose the best located niche within the Columbarium. So it's still important to some people. That same employee told me that a colleague, after 1 or 2 days of work in the same high-end, very nice institution, was so scared of ghosts that her body refused to enter the building on the second day of work. Also, when you question the employee of public cemeteries about memorial parks in particular, you realize that although they could be, in fact, used by anyone, they are used predominantly for the young dead. So that means that people somewhat keep in their mind these categories of the dead. Yes, the young dead meaning the malevolent dead because they died earlier, they were not married, etc. And when you interview people, you find out that within one single family, people decide of which ash disposal they will use or choose, depending on the category of the dead, depending on the classification of their dead. So that will maybe differ from one family or the other, but within one family there's a certain logic in the way they choose the disposals. So only if you interview people you can find out this kind of things. So now what are the discontinuities with the Confucian past? Well, again, the religious affiliations are marked more than ever before. It of course reflects the religious landscape of South Korea, the influence of Christianity, but also the renewal of Buddhism and Buddhist business. This private Buddhist cemetery, as I said earlier, has built within its walls a brand new but old-looking Buddhist temple. It results from the alliance of a businessman, a construction businessman, with a very renowned Buddhist monk. They agreed to work together. So of course this is only reserved for Buddhist customers. You see, one entire room has been bought by one rich church in this private cemetery, Columbarium. In the same institution, one room is reserved to any person who is Catholic. For the rich Buddhist people, there's this VIP Buddhist room in the private cemetery. And it's interesting also to see that the niches, depending on where they are located, they all have a different price. So the highest are the cheapest, the lowest are the cheapest. The one in the middle with the more ornated door, I guess, they are chosen in particular. You see it's more filled around there. And the same applies for the VIP Protestant room. You see that the most expensive niches have been chosen first. There is more and more, there is a stronger and stronger use of science and high technology. That comes from Japan. I think if you go to Japan, you have even more diversity in ash disposal. But anyway, I was shown this niche in particular. So this boy obviously died early, and the employee showed me this niche in particular because he told me that the parents emigrated to the US after he passed away. And even if they're far, and even if they cannot go back often to see him, they can see and they can see the shrine on their cell phone or their computer. There's a system allowing them to do so. Whereas in the past, of course, the top of the social ladder was occupied by the, official, the nobles, and then the educated elite. And now I think the top of the ladder is occupied by TV stars or celebrities in South Korea. At least that's my take. You see at the entrance of this Columbarium, the private Columbarium cemetery, you have the famous dead. You have their pictures on the poster on the left. And not only have you have their pictures, you also have their names and the number of the niche where you can find them, so that the people who visit their own dead can also stop by, leave some flowers, stuffed animals, letters, etc., etc. And on the right side, the cemetery advertises this calendar for television production of 2008. And there were many days that were reserved for people who made dramas, because now it's very common to see scenes taken, shot in the rooms of the Columbarium. So you have the characters going to see the dead, etc., etc. And of course you can imagine that the government is also using the drama on the national channel, probably to even promote more that practice. One of the high-end cemetery, when was that? In 2007, had this huge flat screen TV in its lobby. So they say the lobby is beautiful. It looks like a hotel lobby. And when I entered, I saw this screen, and it played a film showing two TV stars who had committed suicide. and we're very young. So on the left side, you see an urn. People can leave some messages and letters. And obviously, it's great marketing for the place. So now the question is if cremation is so popular, is it only like a temporary fad or trend, or is it a deep change in the culture? The proponents of cremation in South Korea are obviously concerned by the loss of ritual for people if they choose cremation. As I said earlier, there's almost no space for ancestor worship and no religious elements allowed in crematoria. But the members of the council looked for replacement of ritual to go through the mourning process. A lot of them lament the lack of psychotherapies in South Korea. And of course, the collective rituals are also disappearing. So Professor Pak, the historian of the council, had this idea that maybe if people could write letters to the dead, personalized letters to the dead they loved, that will help that process of mourning. So in 2000, they launched this movement of the letters for the dead. So in 2007, when I went to one of the Columbarium in the public cemetery, I saw this poster from that time. It encouraged people to, write letters for the dead. They could drop them in an urn, and the members of the council, with artists and writers of South Korea, they gathered and they chose the best ones. They classified them in terms of relationships. So it was parents writing their children, children writing their parents, siblings writing their siblings, friends writing friends, grandchildren writing their grandparents. And they published a book with a lot of paintings or illustrations, and that became a bestseller. So they also published a second book. And I think it's interesting to see the categories they chose. It's very far from, colleagues, neighbors, or acquaintances. It really is restricted to the nuclear family, or at least like very small, meaningful relationships. Oh, no, not yet. So the conclusion, well, I have several points I want to emphasize. So the change in contemporary South Korea does not always happen top-down like in the past. Citizens and NGOs are very active in changing values, laws, and culture in general. And in fact, I think the government count on them. Agents of social change use history, media technology, and technologies of self, like writing letters to your dead, that didn't exist before, to handle death individually in order to pursue this transition from burial to cremation. Despite the new prominence of cremation, funerary practices reflect continuities with the remote and recent past in the period of transition, when the diversity of ash disposals allows for the ancient distinction between, for example, the good ancestors and the inauspicious dead. Instead of homogenizing practices, cremation has brought an immense diversity in disposals, which generated new problems. The memorial forest was announced as the most promising way of disposing of ashes by scholars and academics. But this new practice worsened environmental issues for a few years before becoming regulated and less popular. On the other hand, columbaria, private columbaria, that ensure the display of religious affiliation and class are becoming mainstream. The population is receptive to environmental arguments, but is not giving up the expression of social status. It's quite the opposite. The memorial forest illustrates how environmental issues and the need for social demonstration were conflicting, but also how what is ecological or green has two different definitions. The environmentalist definition that is based on science, that implies that the protection of the environment with a long-term view, but also people's understanding that burying ashes underneath a tree looks green and pretty. So cremation has redefined all notions of and revisited all notions of pollution and second death, and contributed to the disembodiment of the dead body toward a more scientific and mechanized handling of death. So now I can say thank you.
Thank you. Is there any questions?